Hello, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of Cyturus and Carahsoft, I would like to welcome you to today's webcast, Making Sense of CMMC. Before we introduce today's presenter, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Alex Whitworth, to talk to you about CMMC.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Kara. And thank you to the Cyturus team for letting me do a quick intro here today. I want to welcome everybody to the webcast on CMMC. I am Alex Whitworth. I'm a sales director at Carahsoft, and one of my roles is to help with our CMMC strategy as a company. So before we get started today, I wanted to provide a brief overview of Carahsoft's CMMC resources. Before I do that, for anyone that's not familiar with CMMC, I'll do a quick overview or review of what CMMC is. So the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC for short, is the DoD's effort to increase the overall cybersecurity posture of the defense industrial base as a whole. So DoD information that resides on contractor networks is vulnerable to breach from malicious actors if the necessary cyber protections aren't implemented. So CMMC is the DoD's effort to review and certify the IT systems of the companies that it's buying goods and services from. And that's to make sure critical information that's flowing as part of these contracts is entrusted to companies that have mature cyber protections. So specifically, CMMC is a framework. It's a set of practices organized across capability domains or control families and across 3 maturity levels in the new version 2.0. So the maturity levels start at level 1, or basic cyber hygiene, and they build cumulatively up to level 3, which is expert level cyber maturity. So it's a tiered model, and there are assessment requirements. So when a firm is prepared, depending on the right maturity level, they'll go through one of 3 assessment methods: a self-assessment, a third-party assessment, or a government-led assessment, which is a slight change from the 1.0 version. But the takeaway here is there is a verification component. So regardless of how an organization is assessed, the government will verify. So DoD trusts its contractors, but they understand that they must also verify the assertions that are being made, which introduces a level of accountability that was not executed well in previous compliance programs like the DFARS 7012 rules. And then lastly, CMMC will be implemented through contracts. So once DoD engages in the rulemaking process and the program is solidified, it will be carried out through contracts. The maturity level will be decided at the contract level, depending on the sensitivity of the contract. And then the contractor would be expected to demonstrate the proper maturity level as a condition of award. So what does all this mean for contractors? CMMC will be critical to winning business with the Pentagon. It will be a unified cyber standard, and it could expand beyond just DoD into civilian agencies and beyond. Next slide, please. So with that, Carahsoft can help. We are the trusted CMMC distributor. We partner with great companies like Cyturus that address every CMMC maturity level and capability domain. We have subject matter experts that can help identify the right technology or services for unique environments. And then we can connect organizations with service providers or consultants to help them prepare for CMMC assessment. We provide news, educational material, events, and other resources to help organizations gather information and make decisions. So visit our website at carahsoft.com/CMMC. You'll be able to see information about all of our CMMC products and solutions, of which Cyturus is a key provider. And then next slide, you'll be able to understand solutions by cyber capability domain. So you can click on access control or click on configuration management and understand what tools or service providers can help you address those controls. And then lastly, next slide, you can understand or click on an individual vendor and know what capability domains that vendor can address within CMMC. So with that, I'm very excited to hand the floor over to the Cyturus team and kick off the webcast today. Thank you so much. I'll hand it over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. Looking forward to a great conversation this afternoon with the changes that have taken place on cyber maturity model certification, or CMMC, increased threats and risk to organizational data, third-party vendor risk, and all just in general the increased compliance and framework requirements. It's sometimes difficult to know where to start. So as a follow-up to last month's webinar on changes to CMMC, we have set this time aside today to dive into what immediate action you can take to create and maintain readiness for CMMC and other regulatory requirements. So I wanted to start with just a little more detailed introductions here. We're joined today by three great cybersecurity risk management professionals. I'm excited to hear from them. I know you are as well. So Jack Scott is an executive leader in GRC, Global Cyber Intelligence and Electronics Warfare. She's an 18-year veteran of the Army Special Operations Command and currently holds the CMMC AB Registered Practitioner certification. James Quilty is also a U.S. Army veteran with rich information security and technology background. He supports military and law enforcement missions, both as a non-commissioned military intelligence officer and government contractor. James currently leads the CMMC service delivery team at Cyturus, and I'd like to thank you both for your service, and we're really happy and excited to hear from you today. Robert Hill, our last panelist, is the founder and CEO of Cyturus Technologies. He has over 30 years experience in risk management and cybersecurity as a practitioner, strategist, and thought leader focused on measurable reduction of business risk. So thank you, panelists. We're looking forward to a great discussion today. For the audience, please post questions into the chat as you have them. We'll work them into the discussion, into that discussion. You know, time permitting. This is definitely we have a structure for what we're doing today, but this is for you, and it's for education, and we definitely want you to engage with us as we move this forward. So please ask questions anytime. So Robert, before we jump into CMMC, who is Cyturus? Tell us a little bit about Cyturus.
Dave, thanks for the question. And guys, we really appreciate you joining us on our call today. Just take a quick moment here to talk about Cyturus, because we really want to get into the meat of this and really start talking about CMMC. But Cyturus has a SaaS-based risk management and maturation platform. We developed this by practitioners for practitioners. This was developed so that it helps customers just like yourselves in organizations that are seeking that certification, that are able to manage, monitor, and see not only their baseline of where they are, but categorize that work effort necessary to reach that certification. We use a proprietary process. We also have a quantification modeling that lays on top of the CMMC. And we'll get into a lot more of those later. But again, Dave, thanks for the question. And guys, welcome to the webinar today.
Thank you, Robert. I know this is going to be a review for some of you on the webinar, but James, could you briefly share with us what CMMC is and why it came about?
Thank you, Dave. Yes, absolutely. So where do we start from? Well, let's take a look at a little bit of history in the last couple of years. We've seen a lot of increases in cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. We've seen adversaries start shutting down some power grids across the world, or shutting down the colonial pipeline and creating an interruption in supply chain issue. Additionally, we've seen some of our technologies being taken and repurposed or redesigned to outfit their particular military strategy, such as the F-35. We've seen the Ford Bronco change to a different version or variation through a name change. We've seen imprisonment for a couple other professors that have back-end supplied some of the semiconductor chips to a particular country. So with all this said, there's additional executive orders that have come to fruition, starting with Obama during his era, the executive order 13800, which was in 13636 of February 12th, 2013. What this was to improve the cybersecurity stance of critical infrastructure systems. Additionally, President Trump then signed another executive order, 13800, in May of 2017, strengthening cybersecurity of federal networks and critical infrastructure. Then Biden has come down with another executive order as of May 12th, 2021, Executive Order 14028. This was to improve the nation's cybersecurity posture and to share different information between the government and the private sector and provide that cohesion so that we can mitigate, strategically defend against these cyber attacks. Additionally, DISA has just come out with a DoD cloud computing and security requirements guide. This will help on the cloud front for securing the cloud environments for the CUI, for the purpose of CUI environments. Additionally, CMMC then, was stood up in 2019 to help all of our defense industry or industrial base stand up a protected environment so that we can service the government and protect that data that we are providing to our DoD counterparts as a solution or a service. The CMMC at level 1 decided to go with 5 different levels. Well, based on a lot of information that was brought back to Congress and the government leads, they said, okay, let's trim that down. It's too much for the defense industry base to handle, to implement, to secure, to provide the funding for. So they've streamlined it now down to 3 different levels, and now just to a NIST 800, 171, 110 different controls, along with the 800, 172 additional controls if you are required to be at that level.
Yeah, thank you, James. Jax, speaking of those levels, what are the current certification levels, and how do you figure out what level you are?
Hey, Dave, thank you for the question. And thank you for everybody for showing up for this panel. Excited to be here and to speak with all of you. So I really liked how James really gave you a broad overview. I just want to briefly touch on what he said and be very clear that the CMMC isn't new. He brought up a lot of movement that we've seen in the congressional space. To really take note, though, CMMC was really created almost 2 decades ago when we first saw 9/11 happen. And we noticed then that we were really not very good in the defense industrial base with our data sharing. So now we fast forward, we're in this space, we're really trying to figure out, okay, how do we secure our environments? Well, if we see on the left-hand side, just taking a step back and understanding CMMC level 1, the framework on the right was originally rolled out in January of 2020. And the purpose was really hyper-focused on 5 levels, but 2 and 4 were really just preparatory levels. And so to be clear, level 2 and 4 were not based on any requirements. They were made up entirely by the CMMC accreditation body, and the government never anticipated approving contracts or organizations within level 2 or 4 requirements. So it really made sense to dissolve these levels. And the purpose behind the revision was to really clean up the model and then refocus it. So now what we have on the right-hand side is a more refined and more focused model to be able to go into and help these organizations become compliant. What's really unique about level 1, it's still self-assessed, but something they did different within version 2.0 is they put a self-assessment and they made the organizations now do it within the SPRS, which the SPRS, if you don't know, is the Supplier Performance Risk System. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But the same controls are in place as you saw within CMMC level 1. So not a lot of things changed except for that additional step. Now in level 2, this is where it gets a little bit confusing, but level 2, there were significant changes that we saw. One of the first thing was the removal of the Delta 20. The Delta 20 controls were primarily focused on CMMC A/B. So they removed these. Now, they being the government, we're not sure if the government is going to put in any additional controls as of right now. They're still staying within the framework of NIST 800 171 and staying within the 110 controls, which is good. The other factor, which is a little confusing, is the non-critical versus critical information. And there's a split off within level 2. And that split off isn't defined yet by the federal government of what is critical versus non-critical information. So level 2, you have CUI data. That's why you're at level 2. Now it's starting to determine, are you going to be able to self-assess yourself because you do not have critical information tied to national security? Are you going to still have to have a third-party assessment? That is still to be determined. The next big change was POAMs. They added POAMs, and POAMs actually affected level 2 and level 3. Now, POAMs, what POAMs mean, and we'll dive a little bit further into this, but POAMs are plans of actions and milestones. And why this was a significant change is because the organizations before with Model 1, if you had a gap, you had a gap. You had to mitigate that gap, and there was no way around it. Well, with the POAMs, now they're allowing you to use those as a way to fill that gap, to still land that contract. But the thing with the POAMs is they're not going to let you use POAMs on the highest weighted requirement controls. Now, as with a lot of things within the government, there's still not determination on what that is. Likely what they think is going to happen is they're going to use the 5-point DoD assessment methodology to basically create a baseline for these points, but that is still to be determined. And then level 3, the big change for level 3, it's still hyper-focused on 800-172, but the focus here is, and just keep this in mind, it's contribution to the U.S. warfighter technical advantage. So if you're an organization that provides, say, for example, the F-35, then you're going to be falling in within this category. Otherwise, you're likely going to fall in between number 2, being self-assessed, or having a third-party assessment.
Yeah, thank you, Jax. That was a great overview, and lots to unpack there. James, just building on that, what's the correlation with NIST, ISO, stuff like that?
That's actually a great question, because we've had that question presented to us from various companies, and they'll ask, well, I already have the ISO 9000, or I have the ISO 9000 and the 20000 and the 27001. Where do I fit in from a percentage of compliance against that CMMC? Not all controls relate to evenly to another control within NIST 800-171, but there are some that does translate over or can be mapped to. With that said, if you have all 3 of those ISO certifications, you should be around a good 85 to 90% posture within that CMMC level 1 to 2, somewhere in there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, James. So Robert, anything you want to add in terms of the certification levels? Any other comments from any of the panelists here? And as I do that, there's a couple of questions that came in on the chat, and maybe we can pose those. One question was, the certification is for all contractors level. I think that's kind of a expound on the certification levels, and then there was another question from Lewis on where are the 110 practices, and where can they be found?
Dave, I'm going to turn those over both to Jax in just a moment to expand on those. But I did want to say that to finish the thought on those certifications, where James was talking about whether it be a SB 800-171, whether it be a NIST, whether it be an ISO, it's important that an organization be able to layer those and see the deltas, because so many organizations try to go from the beginning of each of those through the end, and then they start the next one, and then they start the next one. And this becomes a assessment fatigue. And the organization, the resources within those organizations are having to answer the same things over and over. And as James said, they're not a one-to-one match, but you need to be able to, within the system we're going to be talking about and how to do this, is layer those requirements, layer those frameworks, and then see the deltas, see where those differences are, and then be able to address just those without having to go from beginning to end on each one individually.
Sounds like a great argument for a system. So Jax, there was a question around the 110 practices, and where can you find those 110 practices?
I'm actually going to drop a link. Can I do that on the in Answer Live? I'll share a link where you can find those. It's cmmc-coa.com. It's a great resource, and that way it'll break down all of those 110 CUI specific, and then the 61 NFO controls that you're going to need for level 2.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, you should be able to drop that in the chat there. Excellent. And then there's another question there from Michael from Zillion. Has the federal government been able to identify certification trainers, and if so, how can they be identified?
So that's a great question. I'll go ahead and take that one if you don't mind, Dave. So if you look at the CMMC AB website, there's a marketplace in there where they have, what do you call it? Investigated, did background checks, stuff like that, validated that the trainers are, sourced correctly, are providing the training exactly the way it needs to be done by the CMMC requirements. And that's where you're going to find it on that cmmcab.org website at the in the marketplace. That link I can share with you as well.
Excellent, thank you, James. For any of the panelists, any other points that you'd want to make on the certification before we jump into systems? I think one thing that I'd like to mention is that the rulemaking process can take anywhere from 3 quarters to 2 years. They're expecting that they'll release this September of 2022, but that's a little bit of a moving target. November 2023. Once the rulemaking is completed, CMMC 2 becomes a contract requirement. But in the meantime, what all indications are that favorable consideration will be given on contracts to people who gain compliance earlier. So it is important to begin to track that, and no matter where you are in the process, having a plan and building that with that level of understanding is just so critically important. Any other comments on that before we move on? Okay, keep the questions coming. Thank you very much for asking them. And I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide here. So in terms of the certification lifecycle, or in terms of the complying with CMMC, what should that look like, James? What should something like this look like?
Now that's definitely an interesting question. So when I truly look at this, and I did, work with other organizations to track where they're at. Number one, we have to do a readiness baseline on that CMMC framework. Why? Because we need to understand where you're at today. What environment have you prepared for this CUI environment? There's many times that we go into and review with an organization, let's do a readiness baseline, but however, they don't have that CUI environment set up. It's on their business side of the house. So the one thing that we want to do is in this readiness baseline, identify some of the gaps that we're seeing for them, present them with alternate solutions or recommendations, get them a score at that moment. And then once that score is uploaded into the SPRS, which is the supplier performance risk system that was mentioned earlier, you can start seeing the progress that you make to bring that score up. Now, one of the questions also is, from a scoring aspect, we've seen other auditors or assessments done, and they forgot to calculate the fact that there is no policies in place. Well, that policy, that's a huge portion of this scoring. If those are not in place, like an acceptable use policy, encryption policy, bring your own device policy, mobile device policy, clean desk policy, then your score is automatically well into the negatives. It's not in the positives. So we have to identify that first through that readiness baseline. Get your score and then start with the next track of the remediation. Make the recommendations. Where do you want to go from there? What are you responsible for in this environment? Is it only at an FCI level, or is it truly a CUI or higher? Do I have ITAR requirement along with it? So we have to gauge that information, and then we can go from there towards that certification, help you streamline that.
Thank you, James. And Robert. So as we've talked about the transition from CMMC 1.0 to 2.0. James just brought up some of the engagement process. What are some of the key factors to think about when you build the system to comply with CMMC, and how does that extend to other regulatory requirements?
Well, Dave, the first thing you want to do, and go ahead into the next slide if you don't mind. One of the things that you want to do is identify, and James was talking about this, where that identification piece, understanding where that baseline is, understanding where the organization is, understanding what those gaps, what is the capacity and capability of achieving that CMMC. Many organizations that we come into have a false understanding, a false sense of security, if you will, where they've looked, or maybe their MSP has done a high-level assessment, or they've done a self-assessment, and they have a SPUR score that they expect here at this one point. And then when we begin to do those identifications and that score is generated within the system, you begin to see, as James said, that negative number and that going down because these things are missing. The second thing you want to do in a system is begin to measure. What is going to be the impact of the business? What is the work effort? What are the impact of the resources that are going to be performing this additional work? And so you've got to understand what you're measuring as far as work effort against the delivery of those business services. The third thing you want to do is prioritize. So many organizations, as soon as they see gaps, they want to start that remediation process. But you want to initially prioritize that work effort. James mentioned, the environments, the CUI environments, the development of policies. So many times there are prerequisites in this that you need to do these three things before you can reach this. So prioritizing based on that work effort, based on those measurements, based on what was identified in that baseline. And then the last piece is definitely that remediation, that it becomes very, very focused, it becomes calculated, and it's very methodical, because not only do you know what those gaps are, what those immaturities are, what those deficiencies are, you've measured them against the work effort and what needs to be performed, and you've now prioritized them. So your remediation effort really becomes a part of that process, and then you can trend over time. We'll talk about that in a few moments, so that senior leadership can see not just, no, we didn't pass, here was the score and a negative, and then all of a sudden here we are at this score. There's something that happens between that, and that's that trending. That's looking at that improvement over time. And something that we've not mentioned yet is the CMMC AB. There's an expectation of 3 years of maintaining a level of maturity. And so not only over time do you measure that, you have to be able to attest to that maturation, attest to that maintenance or maintaining of the compliance to all of those controls, practices, and procedures across that 36-month time period. So that becomes very important, that you build this system within the organization that maintains that compliance across time.
Wow, yeah, can't emphasize too much that the power of building a system that allows you to measure over time, measure and track over time, and give that ability to manage that maturity, visualization of prioritizing those gaps, and have that visibility across time and depth. So for the panel, we've talked about building the system. We've talked about these steps of identification, measurement, prioritization, and remediation. So how do you start? Where do you get started? How do you build a system? Just for the panel, any comments before we dive into these steps? What's important on this?
jump in on this one really quick. I
Sure.
think that one of the first things, and working with a couple of clients already, is the very first thing when sitting down with a client was understanding their scope before anything else. That was the first thing. What I really found really surprising, and I'm guessing maybe this is across the board, is their lack of understanding of where their CUI data was, or what system touched CUI data versus the systems that didn't. Because something else to note within the certification process is, even if you have, for an example, a SOC that doesn't touch CUI data, or a cloud environment that doesn't touch CUI data, it can still be assessed as part of this, because they believe that CMMC AB still see it as an asset within your organization that could be impacted by CUI. So that's the biggest thing. First thing was sitting down and figuring out, what is the scope, what type of data do you have, and how big is the organization?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. That's actually a good segue into this piece of it. So you know, you're identifying what your CUI data is. You are figuring out your requirements for a system. What about establishing a baseline? Why is that important?
I can jump in on this one as well. So the baseline, and actually this was covered by Robert in fairly good detail. I will provide more context around some of the things he said, and you mentioned it as well. Is one of the things is we need to create a baseline so we can have a measurement tool, so we know our score, especially if we're looking at this with the CMMC lens, which this is what the panel is about. So we need to understand, what is that SPR, our score, what does that look like? And do we have a skewed sense of security? That's going to be the first thing within a baseline, and going into that. You need to understand after that, and working through that, you need to understand your current cyber exposure, and a baseline of vulnerability assessment is going to allow you to do that. And then going back to what I said a little earlier, it also allows you to identify, where is my data, or where is my data not where it should be? That was something that I saw doing an assessment with a client. There was data, and there was CUI data in areas that they didn't think that data should have been located. So that was a great thing for a baseline. And then a baseline really helps stakeholders and leaders have a better in-depth understanding of their current security controls. And without a baseline, you're really working in the cybersecurity space and within your compliance space, in my opinion, blind without a baseline to know where are we at and where do we need to go.
And Jax, this is going to be a really remedial question, but what is CUI data? I always try to define acronyms. What is CUI data?
Yeah, and I didn't define that at the beginning. I apologize, everybody. Controlled unclassified information. So it's information that's critical for the US government, the DoD, the defense industrial space, that could be considered classified information that, if was attained by an adversary or a nation state, could be detrimental to our national security. But isn't data that needs to be on a SCIF or a secured environment, I think is probably the easiest way that I can explain it.
No, perfect. Thank you. That's a great definition. Thank you for that. Robert, as you look at risk measurement, that's such a dicey term. Everybody starts arguments around that. But how do you measure risk?
You know, it's interesting that you asked that, because that is definitely, as you say, a dicey subject. When you start using words like quantification, people have a lot of different definitions on that. You know, you want to measure risk against the delivery of a business service, and that's at the ultimate foundational level. And in CMMC, it is being able to deliver the quality of service securely that the DoD expects. And as you see on the screen, you can look at various methods of quantifying that maturation, quantifying those risks. And you can see things that are not implemented within your organization. And those are things that are simply gaps. You can then take those and measure those against the ability or the impairment of delivering that business service. Then the things that you notice are there in orange, things that are partially implemented, things that are ad hoc, reactionary. Again, it's not something that is a standard operating process, a standard operating procedure. It is a gap, but it's good people doing good things when bad things happen. Then you'll notice things that are in the lighter green, things that are largely implemented, things that are being performed within the organization as a as a matter of either governance or standard operating procedure. However, to have that fully implemented, to be able to measure and quantify that, you have to have a test to it, a test to the effectiveness thereof, and that it is something that is being performed. So utilizing these methodologies of quantification, you can begin to then measure what those potential impacts are to the delivery of those business services. In the case of CMMC, securely be able to deliver those business services and secure the information, the data that has been entrusted within the organization.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. I know that's always a tricky question here. Just for everyone's edification, there's a poll question up on the screen here. Oftentimes there are multiple mandates that people are responsible for. Robert and for the rest of the panel, what's relevant about this when you think about multiple certification or multiple compliance mandates, multiple frameworks? Where can having a system come in handy in that instance?
Well, I'll take a quick answer there at the beginning and then turn this to James, because he has a lot of experience in this also. But it is being able to articulate to senior leadership what those work efforts are. Because so many times there is this laser focus on receiving a specific certification, CMMC, ISO, whatever that is, that all of these other pieces sometimes get less focus. And a system allows an organization to layer those, as I mentioned earlier, to be able to see what the defaults are or the deltas are between them. But it also allows multiple work efforts to be performed simultaneously. So maybe this tool implementation or this policy, as James mentioned earlier, or this particular practice or procedure meets the certification requirements of multiple frameworks. And so a system gives you that ability to tie those frameworks together and understand how those have been implemented within those. James, anything to add on that?
Absolutely. And when it comes to prioritization, you can take a look at what is inside CRT and say, okay, this is not implemented. Should we work on that? Is it partially implemented? Is it fully implemented? Is it largely? You want to take all that information and then start picking at the low-hanging fruit. Is it as simple as all I needed was a policy written, adopted by the organization, and now I'm at 100%, I'm fully compliant or fully implemented for that particular control? It's as really as simple as that. Taking your priorities and setting them out, assigning the tasks to them or to the asset to them, the individual or the funding. That's another component. With this new environment, do I need to have additional resources such as funding or personnel or hardware and software to complete that solution? So we want to actually take a look at the full gamut, your whole environment holistically, and help guide you through that process. Keep in mind that this is going to be a new environment that requires, again, let's go back to Robert's comment about the 3-year period. You have to have continuous monitoring, configuration management, and incident response throughout that whole 3-year period. What does that entail? Is it additional, hardware and software applications that are going to provide that component? Is it additional resources because I already have that component, but I need to now shore up that environment? So, we need to, take a look at that holistically within your environment. It's a complete remediation effort for that piece. Additionally, Jax, I'd like to actually comment a little bit more on your COI data. It's very interesting that you may think that you don't have any CUI data, but the minute that you start layering data on top of data, technical layering, it may become CUI data. So you have to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah. So thank you, James. So in terms of that, Jax, when you think about the process we just talked about, measuring that risk, prioritization of that risk, and then getting to the kind of the back half of this ongoing, this ongoing tracking process. What do we think about in terms of making sure there's value after the report's delivered. So we've gotten the upfront data, we've gotten that upfront process. How do we make sure there's value after the report's delivered, ongoing value?
Yeah, I really like this question because I think it's really important to focus on the after, because CMMC is not going away. There's a lot of organizations that are really confused even on how to do the assessment, even the CMMC AB is, and the clients are really looking at us and our organizations to go and provide them with not only an assessment, but that after guidance. What's the next steps? We've already touched on this a little bit, but one of the key things, and I'm going to clump them into two because I actually have three. So I'm going to clump these two into one. But measurement and tracking, I think they go together very well. It's really important to be able to provide your clients after the assessment a measurable tool to show them where they are within, so they can visually see where are they, and view their cybersecurity resilience, which will allow them to stay effective and in the fight with their cybersecurity within their organization, and to stay compliant ultimately, although we know compliance is not security, but it provides them a good tooling to be able to measure where they're at. And then the tracking helps them to know maybe they're installing new software on their network, or you're moving from an off-prem to on-prem, or vice versa, going into a cloud or a hybrid. That tracking is going to help them to stay in line. So when their certification is up, or when they need a new assessment in, the 1 to 2 to 3 years, depending on what the AB decides, they're not scrambling to start the whole entire process over. So I think that's really beneficial. And then the number two thing, because I've witnessed this with working with clients and they've asked me about this, is what do we get at the end? Are you just going to provide us a gap analysis for the assessment to say, hey, these are all the things you need to fix, and then go away? And of course not. So it's really reassuring them that not only are we going to show you your gaps with your assessment, show you where your COI data is, but we're going to help you with that course of action, those next steps. And that might be mitigation techniques, or those might be poems, but really leaving that client with a feeling of where that future path is going to be and how they can get there.
Thank you, Jax. Super critical, and that consistent connection over time is really what the difference maker is. We talk about tracking that over that period of 3 years, consistently maintaining that level of visibility into what you're doing. So James, as you think about creating a smooth path in terms of reporting, as we kind of move into the reporting phase of this, what are some tips for in terms of a smooth path to prepare for meeting the mandate? Why is it important to build a system? So kind of tying this back in, Jax talked about tracking improvements over time, key visibility. Why is this important, and what are some tips on this?
Absolutely. So number one is planning. After you receive your SPRS scoring, you take a look at, what's involved to mitigate all these different controls, and, prep the POAMs and your secure system security plan. You still have to do a major planning for that environment. So I would definitely set a months for planning. Am I going to, just like Jax mentioned, am I going to, work on the on-prem side of the house and segment a, VLAN off an environment? Am I going to make a hybrid solution, or am I going to fully migrate this to the cloud and handle it in the cloud and build out that solution there? So these are planning steps that have to take place up front, right? Then you need to identify what is your CUI environment going to look like in order to perform that continuous monitoring, the configuration management, and the change management over that 3-year process. I also need to take a look at who needs to see that CUI information. Is it only 1 to 5 individuals? Then I may be able to make a small, tight-knit solution from a cloud aspect or a VLAN aspect. Or do I need it at, for 100 to 500 individuals within my organization, because I have multiple R&D or research and development projects going on that needs to be dedicated to delivering, this information and solutions, technical solutions to the government, such as that F-35 platform, right? So there's a lot of details and decision making and planning that's involved, and that is your number one key component up there, is the planning. After you receive your SPRS scoring through the CRT, you can see where you're at and start strategizing that, to that endpoint or the end status of that environment, and that's what you want to do.
Yeah, thank you for the panel. As we think about reporting, report delivery, and then the idea of continuous improvement from a metrics perspective. Anything else that you'd like to comment on in terms of reporting? Okay, so Robert, kind of tying this together from a systems perspective, as we think about the conversation we're having around building a system, can you kind of tie that together for us and speak a little bit to, we've gone through some of the steps of this. We've talked about building a system, establishing a baseline, continuous measurement over time, and then this repeat process. What are some tips from you, and how do you tie this together?
It is a cycle. And this is not a sprint. It's not going to be done, as James alluded to, immediately. This is not something that's going to be all of a sudden, this is where you were, and then snap of magic fingers and you've got that certification. This is more of a long distance process. This is build that system, understand what it is that's needed, establish that baseline so senior leadership understands what this is going to look like, what the long-term impacts of the organization are, what has to be performed to get to that. And then measure that against the rest of the business, measure that against the delivery of business services, against the resources that you currently have that are going to be dedicated to doing these remediations, prioritize those remediations, and then have the ability to track those improvements, track that through. So again, you have those reporting back to senior leadership to say, this is where we were, this is where we are, this is the improvements that we've gained. And Dave, that brings you to an ROI point where you've got, this is where we were, this is where we are, this is the improvement, this is the reduction of business risk, this is what it costs us to get there. This is that return on investment. This is what we've achieved after spending this money. And then, as you said, getting into those continuous metrics, get into that continuous improvement so that it not only helps the organization achieve that, but it maintains that. Things are going to change in the organization. James was talking about the numbers of employees as companies grow. You may have started out with a small 1 to 5 that have access to CUI. Then you're doing that through some sort of virtual, or you've made it to be on-prem or cloud, whatever your decisions are for architecting that. That changes over time. Business grows, more contracts are awarded, more contracts are won. You bring on more resources. That architecture can change. You've got to have a cycle that you understand, okay, what are the risks? What do we now have to do? What do we have to comply with? And maintain not only what we've achieved, but be able to integrate those changing aspects to delivery of that business and the delivery to those new contracts, and make sure that you maintain that and improve that over time.
Tremendous, Robert. Thank you for that. So I'd like to just go back to the panel and ask you all. We've talked about building a system for risk and security management, not just with CMMC, but with all of your compliance and framework management needs. I guess my question for the panel is really around: do you have anything that you would, as we prepare to get to the Q&A section of what we're doing here, is there anything that you would suggest to us, that, and maybe start with Jax, anything that you would want people to take away from this today, from this conversation today? What are your top couple of recommendations for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So no, I don't want to make this sound negative, but it's going to just be fact and put it out there. But CMMC is not going away, and you are going to have to become compliant in this space if you work in the DIB space, period. It does not matter if you are a 5-person company that only has federal contract information, the FCI information, you're going to have to get certified. That means you're going to have to pay the money, and it's probably going to cost you, depending on what certification, it could be 20,000, 150,000, and you're going to have to do it every 3 years. So I think that's one of the biggest things, is waiting isn't going to do you any good, even though the CMMC is on a pause for 9 months to 24 months, and who knows, as soon as they turn the green light and it is go time, that is, you're gonna have to get in line with everybody else, or you can start preparing now. So that's my biggest thing, right? Is just letting everybody know, start now, just get prepared, because it's going to happen. And somebody else made a comment, they actually put it in the comment section, that the CUI data, I think that in the near future, everybody's going to have CUI data. That's the direction we're going with some of the systems where we're moving in the DoD space. Everything's going to start becoming critical, because our adversaries are going to have an easier way of reaching us. And the more breaches that we have, the more that it's going to be critical information. And we're all going to have to start moving into level 2 and 3. So prepare now. Again, I don't want it to be doom and glory, but that's the case. That's where we're going.
Thank you, Jax. And James, any final thoughts from you on that? Anything you would want to leave the audience with?
She's absolutely correct in that. Start now, because it is a long process, and it's a resource hog, right? Not just from personnel, but also from funding, right? And the planning stage of it. And then, and with this CRT tool, it helps you leverage and be able to upload it instead of using your Excel spreadsheets. That's the one thing I love about this platform. And the fact that it can kick out an SSP. That's huge.
Yeah, thank you, James. There's a question from the audience here. Does the system provide a risk register for? And I missed the question on here. But as we go into that, I'm going to step back for a second and just again thank you all for attending. There's a poll question up right now. What level of CMMC compliance are you subject to? We would love to have the opportunity to, if you have questions about this, to have that discussion with you, and help you understand what that is. If you like the platforms that you saw today, you'd like a demo of what it is that we do, would love to have that conversation with you. Carahsoft will follow up with you directly, but you're welcome to reach out to us on that as well. Robert, in terms of risk register, talk a little bit about the risk register. Is there a risk register within the system, and how does that work?
Absolutely. And I'll make this quick because I know we're running out of time here, but we definitely have an integrated risk register. It ties back to the individual practices, but not only does it have that static risk register, you have the ability to manage your mitigation, manage your contingency plans, manage your attestations and evidence collection. All of the things that are required by the CMMC, you can now manage those and other risks within the organization, cybersecurity risks, business risks, and tie those back and then quantify those risks based on the level of maturity within your organization. Some organizations use a 5x5 to look at the risk. Others use a financial quantification of potential business risk and the impact to the business. So yes, does include risk register and various levels of quantification and lifecycle management of those risks. Thank
you very much, Robert. And again, we're just about out of time. I'll turn things back over to Carahsoft after just encouraging you. There'll be a communication that goes out after this discussion. We're planning a series of these to talk about how to address the various domains. So there's 17 domains that you should be concerned about with CMMC. We're going to have a follow-on series of webinars for that. So my encouragement to you is just to let us know what's most important to you, if there are areas that you're most concerned about, and we'll try to prioritize those. Turn things back over to Alex and Kara. Thank you very much all for attending, and we look forward to talking with you directly.
Yeah, thank you all so much to the panel. At this point, we are going to move on to the Q&A session. So if you would like to submit a question, you can do that at this time. It does look like we did have one more question to the panel. What is the future role of self-assessment, and can we leverage the current?
Or Robert, go ahead. You can take it. I've talked a lot. Go
No,
ahead.
please, Jax, go ahead. I was actually going to turn it over to James because this is a conversation that James and I have had a lot, and we've been on the panels with the CMMC. So please, Jax, you and James take it.
Oh, well, yeah, maybe James, I'll tell you what I know. Right now, you can use the current self-assessment because nothing has changed, meaning nothing has kicked off formally where you're doing the self-assessment and then doing this first portion. But James, since you've talked to the AB, you're more of an expert in this area. So I'll let you add to that or take away what I just said.
No, you're absolutely correct in that, Jax. It is a self-attestation as of right now until the CMMC comes down within the next 9 to 24 months, which I believe started around November timeframe. But it'll come, down with further guidance on how those scores are going to be, be tallied, I guess you could say. Is it self-attestation as an organization based on the 17 controls for level 1? Sure. Is it for the 110 on level 2? For some, yes. It all depends on the contract, and that's where that comes into play. The contract may dictate that. Okay. And if you're going to go for your level 3, well, then that's now a DoD function for the assessment piece, the auditing component, right? That hasn't been stood up yet. It's still going through that process of, okay, who are the auditors out there? Let's bring them on board. Are we going to validate a specific company or a couple of companies for that auditing piece? So there's still some, wheels turning to get this into play, and it's coming down the pipe. Be patient, but again, the recommendation is to start the planning now. Start with the environment, start getting that environment going, because that alone takes a good 3, 6, 9, 12 months, depending on how big your organization and what kind of CUI data is involved.
Just to go into the back of that, James, when CMMC AB came out with those, they made the separation between an RPO and a C3PO doing that audit, that assessment. And one of the things that Cyturus did early on was made the decision to be the RPO, that registered provider organization, that organization that sits with the customer, helps the customer prepare for that. And so we made a very, very strategic business decision not to be that auditor, where we wanted to come in and help customers get ready, whether it's that 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months that James talked about. But even though it could even be a self-assessment, if the organizations do not have that knowledge, if they do not have that in-house resources, we want to be able to assist and help them prepare, measure, prioritize, and then remediate those items.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much to our panel for your participation. And I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. We hope that you found this webcast informative and helpful to you and your organization.